Take your Bibles. If you don't have one with you, you can use the one in the pew there in front of you. And turn to the book of Acts, chapter 22. We've been now, I guess, a year. We started last January, actually, in the book of Acts. And we're here in chapter 22. I'm going to begin reading at verse 23 and read through chapter 23, verse 11. While they were shouting, throwing off their cloaks and tossing dust into the air, the tribune directed that he was to be brought into the barracks and ordered him to be examined by flogging to find out the reason for this outcry against him. When they had tied him up with thongs, Paul said to the centurion who was standing by, "Is it legal for you to flog a Roman citizen who is uncondemned?" When the centurion heard that, he went to the tribune and said to him, "What are you about to do? This man is a Roman citizen." The tribune came and asked Paul, "Tell me, are you a Roman citizen?" He said, "Yes." The tribune answered, "It cost me a large sum of money to get my citizenship," Paul said. "But I was born a citizen." Paul said, "But I was born a citizen." Immediately, those who were about to examine him drew back from him, and the tribune also was afraid, for he realized that Paul was a Roman citizen and that he had bound him. Since he wanted to find out what Paul was being accused of by the Jews, the next day he released him and ordered the chief priests and the entire council to meet. He brought Paul down and had him stand before them. While Paul was looking intently, he said, "Brothers, up to this day I have lived my life with a clear conscience before God." Then the high priest Ananias ordered those standing near him to strike him on the mouth. At this Paul said to him, "God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. Are you sitting there to judge me according to the law, yet in violation of the law you order me to be struck?" Those standing nearby said to him, "Do you dare insult God's high priest?" And Paul said, "I did not realize, brothers, that he was high priest, for it is written, you shall not speak evil of a leader of your people." When Paul noticed that there were some Sadducees and others were Pharisees, he called out in the council, "Brothers, I am a Pharisee, a son of Pharisees. I am on trial concerning the hope of the resurrection of the dead." When he said this, a dissension began between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. The Sadducees say there is no resurrection, or angel, or spirit, but the Pharisees acknowledge all three. Then a great clamor arose, and certain scribes of the Pharisees group stood up and contended, "We find nothing wrong with this man. What if a spirit or an angel has spoken to him?" When the dissension became violent, the tribune, fearing that they would tear Paul to pieces, ordered the soldiers to go down, take him by force, and bring him into the barracks. That night the Lord stood near him and said, "Keep up your courage, for just as you have testified for me in Jerusalem, so you must also bear witness to me in Rome." Paul had been a free ambassador for Jesus Christ for 20 years, as he had set out across what is now Turkey and established churches in the area of Galatia and further west in Asia Minor, part of western Turkey, and then into Greece, into Macedonia, and down into Corinth. But now he was a prisoner of the Roman state. And we might think that being in the hands of the Romans would be worse than being in the hands of the Jews. But we would be wrong in thinking that. As we saw last week, it was actually the Romans who rescued the Apostle Paul from being torn to pieces by the Jews earlier in chapter 22. I want to talk about this morning these three different relationships here. Paul and the Romans first, and then Paul and the Sanhedrin, and finally Paul and the Lord. First, Paul and the Romans here in verses 23 to 29, you have the commander, who is the one who came to rescue Paul. and they arrested him because of this riot. The Jews had been accusing him of some things, and immediately they took him and arrested Paul. The Romans did. The job of this tribune was to keep order in the city. And of course their station was right next to the temple where the ruckus broke out, and someone notified them that this was going on, and so the tribune and 200 soldiers came, broke up the mob, and arrested Paul. They were trying to keep order. But in order to go forward now, the commander had to understand the nature of this conflict. What was it that was going on here? And he assumed that Paul was, he in essence assumed that Paul was guilty of whatever it was, and that he was not forthcoming in whatever crime he had committed. And so what the Romans would do would torture people until they confessed to what it was that they were doing. And they did that by flogging them. And the Roman flogging was so severe that in some cases it actually resulted in the death of the victim. It was that kind of flogging that Jesus himself had experienced just prior to his crucifixion. If any of you had seen the movie Passion of Christ, you see how brutal that flogging is. But then there's Paul's question. As they tie him up and are ready to flog him, he asks, is it legal for you to flog a Roman citizen? Well, that stopped everything immediately. The person who was overseeing this immediately went to the tribune, because this is serious business. You can't, it was illegal to flog a Roman. In fact, it was actually illegal even to bind a person who is not found guilty, uncondemned. And so the guy goes to the commander and says, be careful what you're about to do here. This guy's a Roman citizen. So the tribune goes to Paul, are you a Roman citizen, really? I mean, I had to buy my citizenship. Now, we saw, if you look ahead a little bit in chapter 23, verse 26, you have the name of this tribune, Claudius Lysias. And we said last week that Lysias is a Greek name. Probably he purchased, the reason he purchased his citizenship because he wasn't one by birth. And actually, under Claudius' administration, that administration actually sold citizenships for money. And this is what happened. This is how the tribune got his citizenship. But Paul says, well, I was born a citizen, which means that his father was a Roman citizen. Now, it could be that Paul's father purchased his citizenship. Paul was from Tarsus, what is now eastern Turkey. It's possible that Paul's father purchased his citizenship, which would indicate that it was a very wealthy family. And there are indications that Paul came from a wealthy family because of his background, his education. Or it's possible that Paul's grandfather was a citizen, and therefore his father was a natural-born citizen, as Paul was. We don't know the background there, but Paul was born a Roman citizen. And so the state was even at fault to bind him. What exactly is the role of the state anyway? What does the Bible say about that? The Bible speaks about basically just two roles for the state. One, it is to establish, maintain, and assure justice for its citizens. Establish and assure justice. And secondly, to provide for the defense of its citizens. Those two roles. That's what the Bible speaks of as the role of the state. Those two functions. The problem today is that often we look to the state to do things for us that the state was never intended to do. And the state spends so much time and resources doing the things that it's not supposed to do that it oftentimes neglects the two things that it's supposed to do for its citizens. And oftentimes justice is difficult, even in a society like ours. It often depends on how much money you have on whether you get justice or not. Oftentimes, organizations like the ACLU will bring suit against a school district because they know they've got all this money behind them, and oftentimes a school under a suit will just drop it and forget the whole thing because they can't afford it. And people use that weight of their financial resources, organizations use that, or big companies or insurance companies or whatever, and us ordinary common folk don't have the means to finance that. And so justice isn't done oftentimes. Well, actually the Roman state here was doing its job. It was providing law and order, and it was seeking to find justice in this situation. Once they realized that Paul was a Roman citizen, they did the right thing. And notice the contrast between that and Paul and the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin is the Jewish hierarchy, the Jewish authority, if you will. The Romans were promoting justice and maintaining order. The Sanhedrin was doing neither, maintaining justice or order here in the situation. In fact, they're the ones that caused the riot in the first place by making false accusations that they knew would rouse the people emotionally, and they all rushed to try to tear Paul to pieces. And so Paul says here, in standing before the Sanhedrin, he opens his remarks by saying, I have lived my life with a clear conscience before God. Now, we might think about that comment and say, well, now wait a minute, Paul. After all, you persecuted Christians, before you became a Christian yourself. But what Paul means by this is that he never went against what he thought was the right thing. Remember when Paul, as a Pharisee, as a Jew, he believed that the way, what he called the way, which was this new Christian movement, was totally in the wrong. That they were blaspheming God. They were worshiping someone who wasn't God. And he was zealous for God. So he was going out arresting people that he thought were really opposed to God. He was doing what he thought was the right thing. That's what he means when he says, I've lived my life with a clear conscience. He was doing what he thought was the right thing. Conscience is not an infallible guide to right and wrong. Conscience can tell us that we should not do what's wrong and that we should do what's right. But conscience can't tell us what's right and what's wrong. The only infallible guide for that is the Bible. It can tell us what is right and what is wrong. So a person may think they're doing the right thing. In fact, there are a lot of people in the Middle East who think they're doing the right thing by committing suicide and blowing up a lot of people. They're going according to their conscience. But it's not an infallible guide to right and wrong. And so at this statement, Ananias has the person near Paul slap him across the face. And Paul answers back, well, God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. In other words, he's saying you're a hypocrite. You're breaking the law by slapping me. And you claim, and you're slapping me because I'm a lawbreaker. And then he realizes that this is the high priest, and he, in essence, repents of saying what he said, because he says, it is written, you shall not speak evil of a leader of your people. He's quoting there Leviticus 19, verse 15, which says, he who strikes the cheek of an Israelite strikes, as it were, the glory. Or that's actually the statement based upon Paul's comment about the high priest striking him. But the reference that Paul makes here in verse 5 is from Exodus 22:28 about not speaking evil of a leader of your people. But then Paul